How do you prune tomatoes to get a giant harvest and also prevent plant disease? There's a few great tricks and a few unfortunate gotchas to pruning tomatoes. But once you've got it down, it's something that you'll be able to do for the rest of your life. There's 3 different types of tomato pruning that you're going to need to know, and we're going to go through each and every one of them in a super simple and easy to understand manner. And during pruning, I'll also teach you how to turn your cuttings into whole new tomato plants that you can then grow yourself or give to friends. You might even be wondering, do I even need to prune my tomatoes? Well, we'll be answering all these questions and more in this video, so sit back, hit that full screen button, and let's dig in. Right now we're just a couple weeks away from summer, which means that a couple weeks ago I transplanted all of my tomatoes. They've been going well. About a week ago I trellised them, but now the growth is really starting to take off, so now it's important to really get on to pruning them. Now you might be wondering, why do we even need to prune tomato plants in the first place? Well, we need to understand that tomatoes, even though we might think of them as being a bit bushy, are actually vining plants. That's the same reason that we need to give them a trellis, is that they like to climb up something. In nature, one of the big benefits of a climbing plant is that they don't have to put a whole lot of energy into producing a thick stem or trunk that can then support its whole plant. It gets to just use what's available to it, climb up, and then put lots more energy into producing something like delicious fruit. Now, one of the super cool things that tomatoes do for themselves to help themselves succeed in this sort of environment is, annoyingly, actually a bit of a pain to us gardeners. They produce these secondary vines that we as gardeners have nicknamed suckers. These suckers are great for producing a bigger plant that covers a wider area and then produces more fruit, which will drop more seeds and help the plant reproduce. Unfortunately for us, all of that extra work would actually result in smaller and poorer fruit. And since we're trying to cultivate these plants for the actual tomatoes and we want nice, big, strong, delicious tomatoes, it's in our best interest to prune off these secondary vines we call suckers. So here's how to do that. Now, identifying the suckers is something that when I started gardening and started growing tomatoes, I found quite difficult. But trust me, once you get the hang of it, it's really easy. The first thing that we need to do is actually identify the main stem of the tomato plant, which is usually pretty easy from the base because there's only one point where it actually enters the ground. But then as you follow it up is where it can start to get a bit more confusing. Now, this one's a fantastic example. Please ignore the fact that it's tied up a little bit strange. But what you'll notice is that when we're following it up from the bottom, it makes total sense. It's very obvious which one the main stem is. But then once we get to the top, it's a little bit more confusing, especially as it's been drooping over. That if you didn't know, you might think that this is actually the top of the plant, but this is actually a sucker. And the way that we can identify which the actual main stem is if we follow the other line, we can see that we have what's called a sunleaf coming out at essentially a right angle off this stem. And then in between those two, on a 45-degree angle, we have what is a sucker. Now, I'm probably starting with the most difficult example. I'll show you some others that will make a lot more sense. Another example of looking at a tomato plant to identify a sucker is we see the nice vertical stem, and at nearly 90 degrees coming directly off it, we have what's called a sunleaf. You'll notice that this is really flat and just faces the sky. And then always in between these two, coming off at a 45-degree angle, almost always splitting the difference, is a little bushy leaf, and this is the sucker. The other thing to mention is that suckers and sunleafs are actually just different shapes. Suckers look almost more like mini tomato plants because that's exactly what they are. But sunleafs have this much more flat shape that looks like you can probably just squish into a book and then have this nice, awesome pattern. But suckers are far more tree-like, almost pointy. They look like a miniature plant as opposed to just one set of leaves. I hope that makes sense to someone. But this method of pruning assumes that your tomato plant is an indeterminate variety. 95% of the varieties of tomatoes that we grow in Australia are indeterminate, which what that means is that the tomato will keep growing and fruiting until the cold kills it off, whereas a determinate tomato has essentially a set height that it gets to, and then it fruits and dies. If you want to know what type of variety you have, you need to search for your individual variety. Is this a determinate or indeterminate type? When in doubt, it's probably safe to assume that it's an indeterminate variety. However, if you do find that you have a determinate tomato variety, you still follow all of these rules. There's just one additional rule that you need to follow. You need to find whatever the lowest pod or bunch of flowers or node of flowers that you have on your tomato plant, and then you just remove all of the suckers below that. Say on this plant, which is not determinate, but I can still use it as an example, there's a bunch of flowers here, a bunch of flowers up here. So this is the lowest bunch. I can remove all suckers below it. However, I need to leave all suckers above it. So even though there is a baby sucker coming through up here, I would leave that. There's another baby sucker up here, I would leave that. But then all of the suckers below, such as this one, I can remove, such as this baby one, I can remove, and this one I can remove, and this one I can remove, and this one. And then if that was a determinate, that is perfectly pruned, and you pretty much don't need to prune it again. Now, before we move on to the other types of pruning that you'll have to do for your tomato plant, yes, there's more than just suckers. One final thing to mention about suckers is that when possible, if the sucker is small enough and baby enough, kind of like this one, to where you can really easily just pinch it off with your hands, you're better off doing that as opposed to using pruners, as tearing the flesh of the plant actually leaves less plant damage than cleanly cutting it, believe it or not. So now we've gone through and completely pruned off all of the suckers off all of our tomatoes, and now we get to do one of my favorite parts, which is some of the suckers that we've pruned off are quite sizable, and what's awesome about these is that these can turn into their entirely own tomato plant. We can propagate straight from these. Nowadays, anytime that I'm out pruning my tomato plants, I'll usually bring a couple of pots full of soil ready to go. Because all you need to do to propagate from something like this is you just put it straight into soil. Now you need to keep this soil super wet for days, couple weeks to give it the chance to actually get some roots, because it has no ability to take up nutrition, but essentially the reflex of squeezing water up through its stem is still there a bit. So whatever's sitting just under the stem, it will be able to keep pumping into itself. And the reason that this works is that tomato stems are what's called totipotent, which means that all of the cells can turn into essentially any other cell that it needs, including roots. Now, in this particular example, I think what I might decide to do is just cut off this lower stem, just so there's a little bit less life that this tiny plant needs to continue to support while it's trying to regrow its roots. Now, I'd leave this in a tray of water that you're going to leave water in for a couple weeks to give it that chance. But then you'll find that it starts to actually start looking pretty good and start growing. And in fact, one of my tomato plants over here, because I got some transplant timings from, I have actually propagated from already one of the cuttings from this season. It will be a bit behind. It'll be about a month behind everything else, but hey, a free tomato plant's a free tomato plant. Now, the next type of pruning is super important to keep a healthy and disease-free plant. And that's two things. The first one is in these early stages of life, this almost tomato adolescence, any single leaf that is touching the ground, just take it off. That is the most common entry point for disease to get into your tomato plants. You obviously need them to get to a decent size to where removing one set of lower leaves isn't going to be an issue. But once they are about this big, which you'll find they get to pretty quickly after transplanting, anything that's touching the ground, you just need to remove. Right, truth be told, I actually don't have that many examples around here of leaves touching the ground because I've already gone through and taken them all off. But from one of the few examples that I did find, you can see how quickly the leaves that are in contact with the soil just become completely unhealthy. And you can see how easily this can become a disease entry point to the whole rest of the plant. Now, one of the unfortunate realities about trying to make videos on growing plants is that there's sometimes stuff that I need to cover that I'm not in the right part of the season for, and this is one of them. Once your tomato plants are getting a fair bit bigger, once they're over about 1 meter, one thing you really want to do, everything you can to try and help them get, is as much airflow, especially in the lower part of the plant, as you can possibly give them. And one of our best ways of doing this is Once they're big enough, again, around about a meter, even once it's getting close to that, everything in the first 15 to 20 centimeters, just remove that and leave just the bare stalk of the tomato plant. And what's awesome when we do this is actually a cool opportunity of what I always do and what I've already started, is you can start companion planting a bunch of smaller plants in this little front layer in front of or next to all of your tomatoes. Some great ones are alyssum, a little flowering plant will help bring in pollinators, or basil, because for some reason basil and tomato always seem to grow next to each other really well, which is great because they taste great together. You're growing a culinary garden, if you will, in a really small space. It's an awesome little pairing. So just before we get to the very last type of pruning that you need to know, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. I've heard a rumor that if you comment with a tomato emoji on this video, you will have a bountiful tomato harvest this year. Or I've noticed that about 80% of my viewers aren't actually subscribed to my channel. So if you've watched a fair few of my videos and you like it, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel, it helps this video grow, and we're also closing in on 25,000 subscribers. It should be something awesome to be a part of. Thank you. Now back to the last point. The final type of tomato pruning you need to know is really important for most of us that are growing in spaces where we can't let our tomatoes grow on forever. Now, if you are in fact growing a determinate variety, this is one that you get to skip. But for the rest of us that are mostly growing indeterminate varieties, what we need to do is at some point during the season, when our tomatoes are at the height that we want and we want them to stop focusing all of their energy on growth and start focusing all of their energy on their fruit production, we need to cut off the top node of the tomato plant, which is as simple as it sounds. You will find that at the top of your tomato plant, you usually have a set of buds. You can cut off everything just below that. The tomato plant will no longer keep growing vertically, so this is a great thing to do if you don't have the space to grow a huge trellis, or maybe you can't afford something like a big trellis structure to get the full 2.5 meters that these like. This way you get to grow whatever variety you want in whatever space you want. And then once it's at the height of your trellis, which will hopefully be higher than this and be a bit closer to at least 1.5 meters, try and get to that 180 centimeter mark, ideally just over 2 meters. But really, it doesn't matter that much unless you're trying to be a commercial tomato grower, in which case you are way past all of these sort of techniques. And then all you need to do is cut off the top part of the plant just below that top node, which I am not demonstrating because I want these bad boys to get a lot bigger. All right, look, tomato growing and tomato pruning is a huge subject. There's so much that you can cover. What I really want to get across is I don't want you to feel overwhelmed by it. It's actually pretty simple, and I don't want you to think that you can really stuff up here. The truth is that a lot of this stuff is really trying to optimize the way that tomatoes grow. Anyone who's grown tomatoes for more than a couple seasons will know you at some point have some popping up as weeds somewhere that if you leave them there, you start getting tomatoes off just this big bushy thing. This big glob of tomato bush just starts producing these beautiful red fruit that's probably more delicious and bountiful than anything that you do here. All of this stuff is just helping to optimize everything that you need. Please make sure to hit subscribe. We're closing in on 25,000, which is something I'm super excited about. And if you really want to support the channel, please consider checking out the Patreon. I'll put them all here. They're all a bunch of legends. We have a couple chats in the Patreon where we all talk all things veggie gardening. It's not just a way to support the channel, it's an entire community all to its own. So thank you very much. I'll see you next time.